In 1863, workers clearing hardened ash from a buried street in Pompeii broke through into a hollow space. At its base lay a scattering of human bones, but it was the shape of the void itself that stopped them. It held the precise contour of a body curled tight, arms drawn inward, preserved not in stone or bronze, but in sheer absence. The archaeologist overseeing the dig, Giuseppe Fiorelli, ordered liquid plaster poured into the cavity. What emerged was a figure so immediate that 18 centuries seemed to collapse into a single breath. But that cast captured only a final moment, and Pompeii had lived for nearly 800 years before that moment ever came. Tonight we follow those forgotten chapters, the long-layered existence of a city the world has learned to remember only by its ending. We'll move through the traces left in its walls and soil stones cut by different hands across different centuries, each shift a quiet record of who arrived, who ruled, and who was eventually swept aside. We'll walk through the commerce that carried Pompeii's name across the Roman world and through the upheavals that remade it from within, long before the mountain ever stirred. The land is where it begins, a coastal plain in southern Italy, ringed by hills, warmed by long seasons, and darkened by something most early settlers would not have understood. The soil here was unlike any other in the region. It was volcanic, enriched over millennia by eruptions so ancient that no human memory held them. What remained was a deep mineral-rich earth that made almost anything grow. Olive trees bore heavy fruit. Grapevines ran thick along the slopes, and at the base of the silent mountain the Sarno River cut a steady path toward the sea, offering fresh water and a natural route inland. Sometime in the 8th century BC, a people known as the Oscans farmers and herders from the surrounding highlands made their way down to a low plateau of cooled lava that rose just above the plain. It was a modest beginning. They built 5 small villages of wood and stone. In their language, the word for 5 was Pompe, and so the settlement became Pompeii, a name that at its root may have simply meant the 5, though even this is not certain. Some scholars have traced the word to other origins, and the truth, as with much of Pompeii's earliest life, rests more on suggestion than on proof. For generations the world of the Oscans was bounded by the mountain and the bay. What they knew was the soil, the harvest, the weight of seasons turning. But the sea was a highway, and it would not leave them undisturbed for long. Around 740 BC, Greek colonists founded the city of Cumae, just across the bay, the first Greek settlement on the Italian mainland. These were not hill farmers. They were mariners and merchants people who understood the world as a network of ports and who saw the mouth of the Sarno as a perfect gateway into the fertile interior. What the Greeks brought was not conquest, it was contact. For the first time, the people of Pompeii handled fine pottery painted with scenes of gods and heroes. They tasted smoother wine and lighter oil. They watched as their own craftsmen began to study the elegant forms of Greek vessels, slowly blending foreign techniques with local traditions. It was a cultural exchange that moved in one direction at first, but over time it reshaped both sides. A grand Doric temple rose on a bluff overlooking the bay in the 6th century BC, built not by Greeks but by Oscans in the Greek style. A farming settlement was beginning to see itself as part of something wider. And then from the north another force arrived. The Etruscans, master builders, disciplined warriors, organisers of trade pressed south into Campania and drew Pompeii into their orbit. Under Etruscan influence, the town raised its first true city walls cut from blocks of soft volcanic tufa. The enclosure was designed with unusual foresight. It wrapped not only the town's core, but also a wide band of surrounding farmland, ensuring that even under siege the people could sustain themselves. But Etruscan ambition overreached. A naval defeat at Cumae in 474 BC broke their hold on the coast and their presence faded from the region. What followed was a period of quiet decline. Trade routes dried up, ships grew scarce at the river's mouth, and Pompeii shrank back into a provincial stillness. It would not stay still. From the mountains of Italy's interior came the Samnites, a fierce independent people who shared the Oscans' deep ancestry and language. Under their rule, Pompeii was not merely occupied, it was rebuilt. The old tufa walls were replaced by something far more formidable. 2 parallel walls of hard Sarno limestone, the gap between them packed with earth and rubble, forming a rampart thick enough to absorb the blow of any siege engine then known. Behind these defences the city flourished, The Forum was reshaped into a monumental civic centre. Grand houses rose, temples were enriched. Pompeii entered what may have been the most confident chapter of its long life, a powerful Samnite city rooted in Oscan identity, coloured by Greek and Etruscan legacies armoured in stone. But confidence in this part of the world has always carried a particular weight. To the north, a single city-state was rising with a discipline and appetite for expansion that none of its rivals could match. Rome would reach Pompeii not all at once, but in waves, first as a distant rumour, then as a raiding fleet along the coast, and finally after decades of war, as the power that demanded submission or annihilation. Pompeii, as it had done before and would do again, chose to survive. What that survival cost and what it built in the centuries that followed is where we go now. The dark soil. The plateau was not least large. It rose perhaps 30 metres above the surrounding plain, a shelf of cooled lava from an eruption so old that no human chronicle had ever recorded it. On one side the land dropped toward the Sarno River. On the other, the ground sloped gently toward a wide bay that opened onto the Tyrrhenian Sea. Above it all, filling the northern horizon, stood a mountain green, with forest quiet, its summit softened by centuries of stillness. No fire had come from it in living memory. No story passed down from elder to child carried even the rumour of what it had once done. The mountain was simply there, a backdrop, a provider, and what it provided more than anything was the soil. The volcanic earth that covered this part of Campania was unlike the ground found almost anywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean. It was dark, mineral-filled, dense, and extraordinarily fertile, the accumulated gift of eruptions stretching back tens of thousands of years. Crops planted in this earth did not merely grow, they flourished with a vigour that neighbouring regions could not match. Olive trees bore fruit in abundance, grapevines ran thick across the hillsides, producing a wine that was heavy, dark and potent, and grain filled the fields season after season, while the forests climbing the mountain slopes offered timber enough for homes and fuel enough for fires. It was by almost any measure a generous place to settle. But generosity of this kind is never without a source, and the source in this case was dormant, not gone. Sometime in the 8th century BC, a people known as the Oscans arrived on this plateau. They were not mariners or empire builders. They were farmers and herders who had made their way down from the highlands of the Italian interior, moving slowly through the valleys of Campania until they found ground worth stopping for. The plateau above the Sarno offered nearly everything a farming community could want: elevation for safety, water below, for irrigation and soil that responded to every seed with startling returns. They did not build a city. They built 5 small villages, clusters of huts made from woodstone, and whatever the land offered. With no great public buildings, no monumental walls, no temples in the style of the Eastern Mediterranean, life was organised around the harvest, the seasons, and the needs of livestock. And yet even this earliest chapter carries a detail that has drawn the attention of linguists and historians for generations. In the Oscan language, the word for 5 was Pompeii. And from this, according to the most widely cited explanation, the settlement took its name Pompeii, the 5, a name that, if this etymology holds, tells us something unexpectedly plain about the city's origin. It was not named for a god or a hero, or a victory. It was named for a number 5 villages on a volcanic ridge bound together by the soil beneath them. Though it should be said that not all scholars accept this derivation with equal confidence, and some have proposed alternative routes that remain unresolved. The honest answer is that the name's true origin sits just beyond the reach of certainty, which is fitting for a place whose earliest centuries are themselves more shadow than substance. What we know of the Oscans at Pompeii comes not from their own writings. They left none that survive from this period, but from the fragments they left in the ground. Shards of simple, functional pottery, post holes suggesting the outlines of timber-frame dwellings, traces of early agricultural activity visible in the soil profiles beneath later Roman construction. These are not the bold declarations of a civilization eager to be remembered. They are the quiet residue of people who lived close to the earth and expected nothing beyond it. And yet this quiet beginning was not as isolated as it might appear. The plateau the Oscans chose sat at a natural crossroads where the Sarno River connected the inland plains to the coast, and the bay opened onto sea lanes linking southern Italy to Greece, North Africa, and the wider Mediterranean. Even if the Oscans themselves were not seafarers, They had placed themselves, perhaps without fully understanding it, at a point where the inland world and their maritime world would inevitably meet. That meeting was already underway to the north and south. Greek traders had been exploring the coasts of southern Italy for decades, probing for harbours, for resources, for points of contact with the peoples of the interior. The Sarno's mouth, calm and navigable, would not escape their attention for long. For now, though, the plateau was still quiet. The Oscans tended their olive groves and vineyards, stored their grain, and watched the seasons turn against the unchanging outline of the mountain. They could not have known that the very fertility sustaining them was a debt the land would one day collect. They could not have known that the sea visible from the edge of their ridge would soon carry strangers with a very different understanding of the world, people who saw the landscape not as a place to farm but as a network of harbours and routes and opportunities waiting to be claimed. What arrived first was not an army, and not a fleet in any military sense. It was something far more transformative, an idea of connection carried on the hulls of trading ships that would begin to pull this small Oscan settlement out of its quiet self-sufficiency and into a story far larger than 5 villages on a hill. The ships came from across the bay, and with them the world that Pompeii had never asked for began to take shape around it. Strangers across the bay. Around the year 740 BC, on a rocky headland across the Bay of Naples, a group of Greek colonists from the island of Euboea founded a settlement they called Cumae. It was the first permanent Greek city on the Italian mainland, and its purpose was not agricultural but strategic, a forward base for trade, a foothold on a coastline rich with resources and ripe with possibility. The men who built Cumae were not farmers drawn by fertile soil. They were mariners, merchants and opportunists from a civilization already centuries old. People who understood the world not as a patchwork of fields, but as a web of harbours, sea lanes and exchange routes. Their arrival on the Campanian coast was quiet in military terms, but in cultural terms it was seismic. Within a generation, the Greek presence would begin to reshape every settlement within reach, and the small Oscan community on the plateau above the Sarno River was very much within reach. The Greeks did not come to Pompeii as conquerors. They came as traders, and what they sought was simple, the raw bounty of the Campanian interior. Timber from the mountains' forests needed for the construction and repair of their ships, surplus grain from the fertile fields, the oil and wine that the volcanic soil produced in such remarkable quantity. In return, they offered the products of a world the Oscans had never encountered. Fine pottery arrived painted with intricate scenes of gods, heroes, and mythological battles rendered in a style that was sophisticated, narrative, and entirely foreign. Elegant bronze vessels appeared in the settlement, along with smoother oils and the lighter wines produced according to Greek methods. These were not merely luxury goods, they were windows into a different way of seeing a different set of values, a civilization that placed enormous weight on beauty, storytelling, and the display of refinement. The detail that matters here is not that the Oscans received these objects, it is what they did with them. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests that Oscan craftsmen did not simply admire and accumulate Greek imports, they studied them. Pottery fragments recovered from layers dating to the 7th and 6th centuries BC show a gradual shift in local production forms, becoming more elegant, decorative motifs appearing where none had existed before, techniques borrowed and adapted from the Greek tradition, but blended with older Oscan methods. This was not imitation for its own sake. It was cultural absorption, slow and selective, the kind that happens when two societies are in sustained contact and one begins to internalize the aesthetic language of the other. Leaders who had governed by custom and physical authority began to witness a different model of power, one rooted in wealth, in trade relationships, in the ability to command access to goods that carried prestige. The old order did not collapse overnight, but it began to tilt imperceptibly at first towards something new. The most visible monument to this transformation appeared in the 6th century BC, when a grand Doric temple was constructed on a prominent bluff of land overlooking the bay. This was not a modest open-air shrine to local spirits, which was the traditional Oscan form of worship. It was a monumental structure built in the pure Greek architectural style, stone columns at a formal plan, a scale that announced ambition and connection to the wider Mediterranean world. No inscription survives to tell us precisely who commissioned it or which deity it honoured, and scholars have debated its dedication for decades. But its meaning as a cultural statement is difficult to dispute. A settlement of Oscan farmers had chosen to express its public identity through a Greek architectural vocabulary. Pompeii, without changing its population or its language, was becoming something it had never been before, a meeting point between the earthbound Italic interior and the dynamic seafaring civilization of the Greeks. But the Greeks were not the only power watching Campania with interest. As their influence solidified along the coast, a very different force was pressing down from the north. The Etruscans' master engineers, sophisticated artists, and disciplined military organisers had been expanding their territory for decades, and the legendary fertility of Campania drew them south with a gravitational pull they could not resist. They established a great stronghold at the inland city of Capua, and from there their influence radiated outward across the region like a slow tide. Pompeii, sitting on its volcanic ridge between the coast and the interior, was inevitably pulled into their orbit. The nature of this incorporation remains a matter of scholarly interpretation. The transcript of surviving evidence suggests not a violent conquest, but a political and economic alignment. The Etruscans were organisers above all, and they appear to have integrated Pompeii into a regional network that maximised agricultural output and regularised trade along the Sarno. Under their influence, the town's prosperity swelled, and with it came the first true statement of civic permanence. Pompeii began constructing its earliest city walls, a formidable barrier, built from blocks of tufa, a soft but workable volcanic stone quarried from the surrounding landscape. The design of these walls reveals something about the mentality of the builders, or at least of those who directed the project. The enclosure was drawn far wider than the existing settlement required, encompassing not only the town's core of homes and workshops, but also a broad swath of surrounding farmland. This was not the wall of a city expecting peace. It was the wall of a city expecting sea, designed to ensure that even if cut off from the outside world, the population within could sustain itself on the food growing inside its own defences. It was a piece of military foresight embedded in stone, and it tells us that whoever shaped Pompeii's early development understood that the wealth of Campania was a magnet, and magnets attract more than just merchants. For half a century, a tense equilibrium held between the Greek cities of the coast and the Etruscan strongholds of the interior. Then in 474 BC, the balance shattered. The Etruscans launched a major naval assault against Cumae and were decisively defeated. With their sea power broken, their grip on Campania loosened and then collapsed entirely. The Etruscan presence faded from Pompeii, leaving behind traces of their organisational imprint in the layout of the walls and the structure of homes, but little else that endured. And in the aftermath of their departure, a heavy quiet settled over the region. The trade networks that had connected Pompeii to the wider world fell apart. Ships that had crowded the river's mouth grew scarce. Inland roads fell silent. The city that had been growing outward now began to contract inward, and for a generation or more Pompeii became what it had not been since the earliest days of the Oscan settlement, a provincial town overlooked and overshadowed, waiting without knowing it for the next wave of change to arrive from the mountains to the east. Stone armour. The limestone blocks that the Samnites used to rebuild Pompeii's walls were not quarried from the mountain. They came from the bed of the Sarno River itself, a hard, dense stone formed over millennia by mineral deposits in the flowing water. It was heavier than the soft tufa the Etruscans had favoured, more difficult to cut and far more resistant to the impact of siege weapons. The choice of material alone tells us something about the people who made it. The Samnites were not interested in convenience. They were interested in permanence, and the walls they raised around Pompeii were designed not merely to enclose the city, but to declare in the most physical terms possible that it would not fall easily. Two parallel walls of Sarno limestone rose from the earth, and the space between them, sometimes several metres wide, was packed tight with rubble and compacted soil. The result was not a wall in the ordinary sense. It was a rampart, a thick absorptive barrier that could take the punishment of battering rams and stone-throwing engines without cracking the way a single curtain of masonry might. The Samnites had arrived from the mountains of Italy's interior sometime after the Etruscan withdrawal, filling the power vacuum that had left Pompeii stagnant and exposed. They were a fiercely independent, warlike confederation of tribes who shared a deep ancestry with the Oscans, the same people who had originally settled the 5 villages on the plateau centuries before. In a sense, the Samnite takeover was a homecoming of sorts, a reassertion of Italic identity after generations of Greek and Etruscan cultural overlay. Under their rule, the Old Oscan language was restored to prominence in government, religion, and the conduct of public life. Latin was not yet the language of power in this part of Italy. Greek had been the tongue of commerce and sophistication along the coast. But now in the markets and the meeting places of Pompeii, the sound that carried furthest was Oscan familiar grounded and deliberately reclaimed. Whether this linguistic revival was a matter of policy or simply the natural consequence of a new ruling class imposing its own Hackean habits is not entirely clear, but the effect was unmistakable. Pompeii, after centuries of absorbing foreign influence, was reasserting its oldest voice. Stability followed, and with stability came wealth. The agricultural engine of the Campanian plain, momentarily disrupted by the collapse of Etruscan trade networks, roared back to life under Samnite management. The olive groves and vineyards that had always been the region's greatest asset were cultivated with a renewed intensity, and the surplus flowed outward again down the Sarno to the coast across the bay and into the wider Mediterranean market. The Samnite elite, enriched by this agricultural abundance, began to build on a scale the city had never seen. Their houses were not the modest huts of the early Oscan period, nor the functional dwellings of the Etruscan years. They were grand residences organised around central courtyards with plastered walls, painted decoration, and a spatial generosity that spoke of confidence and means. Some of these homes occupied entire blocks, their footprints so large that later Roman construction would struggle to match them. The Forum, too, was transformed. What had been a simple open marketplace, a patch of common ground where farmers traded surplus and disputes were settled by custom, was reshaped into something more deliberate, more architectural, more consciously civic. Colonnades began to frame its edges, temples were enriched and formalized. The Forum became not just a place of commerce, but a stage for public life, a space where the city could see itself and perform its own identity. This was Pompeii at what some scholars consider its cultural peak, not its wealthiest moment, which would come later under Rome, and not its most architecturally spectacular, but its most self-possessed. The city's identity during the Samnite period was a layered thing, a palimpsest of influences absorbed over centuries but held together by a fierce sense of Oscan roots. The Greek legacy survived in the temples and in the artistic vocabulary of its craftsmen. The Etruscan imprint lingered in the layout of the walls and in certain organisational habits of civic life. But the ruling spirit was Samnite martial proud and deeply invested in the idea that Pompeii's destiny belonged to its own people. It was a confidence that expressed itself most powerfully in those double walls of river limestone standing thick and resolute around a city that believed it had finally found its permanent shape. The detail is worth holding on to because that confidence was about to be tested by a force unlike any Pompeii had encountered before. To the north, beyond the hills of Campania, a city on the banks of the Tiber had been growing for centuries with a patience and discipline that none of its neighbours could match. Rome in the 4th century BC was not yet the empire of marble and legend. It was a republic of soldiers, engineers and lawmakers, pragmatic, organised and possessed of an appetite for expansion that seemed to have no natural limit. One by one it had absorbed the peoples of central Italy, the Latins, the Volsci, the Hernici, not always by outright conquest, but through a system of treaties, alliances, and obligations that drew each defeated neighbour into a web from which there was no easy exit. For the Samnites, whose territory stretched across the mountainous spine of southern Italy, Rome's advance represented something more than a political threat. It was an existential one. What followed was a conflict of extraordinary duration and bitterness. The Samnite Wars, 3 separate rounds of fighting that stretched over more than half a century and turned the hills and valleys of central and southern Italy into a killing ground. Pompeii, as a loyal Samnite city, was drawn into this struggle with all the consequences that loyalty entailed. Men marched from its gates to join the Samnite armies in campaigns that took them far from home. Farms were requisitioned for the war effort. The city waited season after season for news that grew steadily worse. Around 310 BC, the war arrived at Pompeii's own doorstep when a Roman fleet landed on the nearby coast and sent raiding parties into the surrounding countryside, burning fields, seizing livestock, and demonstrating with this brutal clarity that no corner of Campania was beyond Rome's reach. Local forces rallied and drove the raiders back to their ships, but the message was not one that could be unsent. The walls that the Samnites had built with such care and such confidence were strong, Whether they were strong enough for what was coming was a question the city would soon be forced to answer. The Gilded Cage. By 290 BC, the last Samnite army had been broken. The wars that had consumed half a century swallowed entire generations of young men and turned the Italian peninsula into a landscape of ash and exhaustion were finally over. For Pompeii, the arithmetic of survival was brutally simple. Its protectors had been defeated, its allies had been scattered or absorbed. The double walls of Sarno limestone still stood unbreached, but walls without an army behind them are only stone, and stone without purpose is just weight. The city faced a choice that was no choice at all. Resist alone and be destroyed, or submit and endure. Pompeii, as it had done before in moments of existential pressure, chose to live. It accepted terms with Rome and became a socius, an allied city bound by treaty to a power it had spent decades fighting against. The word socius carried a veneer of partnership, of mutual respect between equals. The reality was something far less balanced, and the people of Pompeii understood this from the very first day. The terms of the arrangement were precise in their asymmetry. Pompeii lost the right to conduct its own foreign affairs. Its long-standing relationships with other cities and peoples, trade agreements, diplomatic ties, cultural exchanges that had been cultivated over centuries were now subject to the approval of the Roman Senate. Most consequentially, the Estes was obligated to provide soldiers for Rome's military campaigns, contributing men and resources to wars that served Roman interests, not Pompeian ones. In return, Rome offered protection and a measure of internal autonomy. The city could govern itself, its magistrates could administer local justice, its temples could honour its own gods, its markets could operate according to their own customs. Life within the walls, in other words, was permitted to continue much as it always had provided. That when Rome called, Pompeii answered. It was in the language of a later age, a gilded cage, comfortable enough to discourage rebellion, constrained enough to prevent independence, and designed above all to extract value in soldiers, in grain, in loyalty from the subordinate partner without provoking open revolt. For nearly 200 years the arrangement held, and during those 2 centuries something remarkable happened. Pompeii prospered. Protected by the vast military umbrella of Roman power, the city no longer needed to fear the raids and invasions that had punctuated its earlier history. The sea lanes were secure, the roads were safe, trade flowed freely, and the agricultural wealth of the Campanian plain, the wine, the oil, the grain that the volcanic soil produced, in such relentless abundance found markets across an expanding Roman world. The Pompeian elite, enriched by this commerce, adorned the city with monuments that reflected both civic pride and a growing sophistication. The first public baths appeared elegant structures that introduced the Roman ideal of communal bathing and social gathering. New temples rose dedicated to gods that blended the old Oscan pantheon with newer influences. And a grand theatre was constructed, its semicircular tiers of stone seating, carved into a natural slope, becoming the centerpiece of the city's cultural and civic life. From the outside, Pompeii in this period looked like a success story, a former enemy transformed into a thriving partner within the Roman system. But prosperity purchased with subordination carries a particular kind of poison, and it works slowly. Generation after generation, Pompeian men were conscripted to fight in Rome's wars, campaigns in Greece, in North Africa, in Spain, in places most of them had never heard of and would never see again. They fought with distinction. They bled and died alongside Roman legionaries on battlefields across the Mediterranean, and yet they remained in legal and political terms something less than Roman. They were allies, not citizens. They could fight for the empire, but could not vote in its assemblies. They could die for Rome's glory, but could not share in its political rewards. The imbalance was not theoretical. It was felt in every household that sent a son to war, and received nothing in return but the right to continue sending sons. Over decades, this resentment accumulated like pressure beneath a sealed surface, invisible, patient, and increasingly difficult to contain. In 91 BC, the surface cracked. The Roman Senate, for reasons rooted in its own internal politics, once again refused to extend citizenship to its Italian allies. The refusal was not new. Similar demands had been made and rejected before, but this time the rejection met a population whose patience had been entirely exhausted. Across the peninsula, allied cities rose in coordinated rebellion. The conflict that erupted was called the Social War, from the Latin sovii, and it was among the most vicious and destabilizing struggles Rome had ever faced, precisely because it was not a foreign invasion but a revolt from within a war fought by men who knew Roman tactics intimately because they had been trained in them. Pompey joined the uprising alongside its neighbours in Campania, and within the city the gesture of defiance was given a pointed cultural dimension. Latin, the language that had been creeping into public life through decades of Roman influence, was formally set aside. Oscan, the tongue of the city's founders, the language of family and memory and ancestral identity, was restored as the medium of law and governance. It was a declaration of sovereignty written not in blood but in syllables, and Rome understood exactly what it meant. The Republic's response was swift and without mercy. To pacify Campania, the Senate dispatched one of its most capable and most ruthless commanders, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In 89 BC, his legions arrived before the walls of Pompeii, and the men of the city took up their positions on the great limestone ramparts that the Samnites had built with such care 2 centuries before. The siege fell on the northern walls, the strongest section of the defences, but also the most exposed, facing an open plain where Sulla could mass his infantry without obstruction. For weeks, Roman siege engines hurled stones against the fortifications. The walls held, the defenders held, the limestone absorbed the blows as it had been designed to do, and no breach was opened. But Pompeii's fate was no longer a matter of engineering. Across Campania, the wider rebellion was collapsing, its allied cities falling one by one to the disciplined power of Rome's legions. When the last of Pompeii's allies surrendered, the city found itself alone, its walls intact, its garrison unbroken, but its cause utterly lost. There would be no relief column, no second front, no rescue from beyond the horizon. The defenders laid down their arms, the gates were opened, and Sulla's soldiers marched through in silence. Pompeii had survived again, but this time survival would come at a cost the city had never paid before, one measured not in stone or blood, but in the erasure of everything it had once believed itself to be. Erasure in stone, Sulla did not return to Pompeii immediately. After the siege, he was drawn away by larger and more urgent conflicts, a vicious civil war in the streets of Rome itself, followed by a prolonged military campaign in the eastern Mediterranean. For 9 years, Pompeii existed in a strange and anxious limbo, a conquered city whose sentence had not yet been delivered. The great building projects of the Samnite era ceased. Commerce that had once filled the river port dwindled to a fraction of its former volume. Magistrates continued to govern, markets continued to function, and people continued to live their daily lives. But everything was provisional, everything was shadowed by the knowledge that the man who held the city's fate in his hands was still out there, still accumulating power, and would eventually turn his attention back to the place that had dared to resist him. When Sulla finally returned to Italy, he came not as a general but as a dictator, the undisputed master of the Roman world, answerable to no senate, no assembly, no law, but his own will. And in 80 BC, that will fell upon Pompeii, with a precision that was in its own way more devastating than any siege engine. The judgment was not destruction, it was refoundation. Sulla decreed that Pompeii would be reconstituted as a Roman colony, erasing its identity as a Samnite city and replacing it with a new one created entirely in his own image. The city received a new name, Colonia Cornelia Fetiria Veneria Pompeianorum, and every element of that title was a deliberate act of possession. Cornelia honoured Sulla's own family clan, the gens Cornelia, binding the city's public identity to the personal lineage of its conqueror. Veneria was a dedication to Venus, the goddess whom Sulla claimed as his divine patron, the supernatural source of his military fortune. The old name Pompeii survived only as a suffix, a geographical reference stripped of political meaning. The city now belonged in name and in law to the Cornelii and to Venus. Its old gods, its old families, its old sense of self, all were formally overwritten. The detail is worth pausing on because what Sulla undertook was not merely a punishment. It was a template, a method of cultural absorption that Rome would refine and repeat across its expanding empire for centuries to come. The most immediate instrument of this transformation was demographic. Approximately 2,000 of Sulla's veteran soldiers were settled in Pompeii as the city's new colonists. These were men who had followed their general across Italy and into the East, men hardened by years of brutal campaigning, men who had earned their retirement through loyalty and violence and now expected their reward. they received it. The great Samnite families who had led or supported the rebellion were stripped of their property, their ancestral homes within the city walls, their fertile vineyards and olive groves on the surrounding hillside, and this confiscated wealth was redistributed to the veterans. In a single administrative act, the social hierarchy of Pompeii was inverted. Men who had been the city's ruling class for generations found themselves dispossessed, while strangers who had never set foot in Campania before were installed in the finest houses and given control of the richest land. The veterans became overnight a new Roman elite, planted directly on top of the defeated population, and the friction between these two communities would shape the city's internal life for decades to come. The linguistic transformation was equally systematic. Latin, the language of the conquerors, became the mandatory medium of law of commerce and of public ambition. Any Pompeian who wished to participate in civic life, to hold office, to argue a case in court, to bid on a public contract, had no choice but to operate in the language of Rome. Oscan did not disappear. Languages rarely die so cleanly, but it was driven from the forum and the courthouse, retreating into the quieter, more private spaces of domestic life. It became the language of family meals, of prayers whispered at household shrines, of conversations between grandparents and grandchildren in rooms where no Roman magistrate would overhear. Within a generation, the public voice of Pompeii had changed entirely, and with it the texture of daily interaction, the rhythm of negotiation, the very sound of the city's streets. Some scholars have noted graffiti and inscriptions from this transitional period that mix Oscan and Latin in a single text, suggesting a population caught between two linguistic worlds, fluent in neither, and grieving perhaps without fully articulating it the loss of the one that had been their own. To make the conquest permanent in the most visible way possible, the new rulers undertook the monumental task of reshaping Pompeii's physical environment. The forum, which for centuries had been the centre of Samnite public life, was systematically rebuilt as a showcase of Roman civic architecture. On its western side rose a new basilica, a massive rectangular hall that served as the seat of law and commerce, its high walls and colonnaded interior designed to project the authority and procedural order of the Roman state. Nearby, the city's main temple was rebuilt as a Capitolium dedicated to the triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. The official gods of Rome, the divine patrons of the Senate and the Republic. Together, these buildings proclaimed a new hierarchy of faith and governance, binding the citizens of Pompeii to Rome through both legal obligation and religious observance. The forum baths were constructed in the same period, establishing a sophisticated centre for the Roman practice of communal bathing, a ritual that was not merely hygienic but deeply social, a daily routine of physical care, conversation, and informal political exchange that lay at the heart of Roman civic culture. Beyond the forum, the transformation continued with structures designed to forge a shared emotional life for a divided population. A great amphitheatre rose on the city's eastern edge, one of the earliest permanent amphitheatres in the entire Roman world, an enormous elliptical arena capable of holding the city's entire population for the filmed spectacle of gladiatorial combat. Nearby, a smaller roofed theatre, the Odeon was built for music, poetry, and more refined performances. The message embedded in this pair of buildings was deliberate and layered. Pompeii was to be a city of both sword and lyre, of raw power and cultivated taste, a place where Roman authority expressed itself not only through force of law, but through the shared experience of spectacle and art. Whether the original Pompeian population experienced these new institutions as gifts or as instruments of control is a question the archaeological record cannot fully answer, but the stones themselves suggest that within a generation, the divisions began slowly, unevenly, and never entirely to blur. What the stones do not say. It would be convenient if the story we have been following moved in clean, unbroken lines, one civilization arriving, another departing, each transition marked by a clear date and a legible cause. But the truth, as any archaeologist who has spent years on hands and knees in a Pompeian trench will tell you, is that the ground resists simple narratives. Layers blur into each other. Objects appear where they should not be. Dates that seem firm in textbooks rest when examined closely on chains of inference that are longer and more fragile than most popular accounts care to admit. Before we continue forward into the centuries of Roman Pompeii, it is worth pausing here to acknowledge what we do not know and to sit for a moment with the discomfort of that uncertainty, because it is in the gaps, not in the confident declarations, that the most honest understanding of this city begins. Consider the very name. The explanation offered most frequently that Pompeii derives from the Oscan word Pompi, meaning 5, referring to the 5 original villages, has a pleasing simplicity that makes it easy to remember and satisfying to repeat. It appears in guidebooks, in documentaries, and countless introductions to the city's history, and yet it remains in the strictest scholarly sense a hypothesis rather than a fact. No surviving Oscan inscription confirms that the settlement was ever formally named for a number. Alternative etymologies have been proposed, some linking the name to the Oscan word for a procession, or a sending forth others, connecting it to the Ginans Pompeia, a prominent Italic family name, and none of these alternatives has been conclusively ruled out. The honest position is that we do not know with certainty where the name came from, and the confidence with which the 5 villages explanation is often presented outpaces the evidence that supports it. This is a small point perhaps, but small points have a way of compounding. If we are willing to state the origin of the city's name as settled fact, when it is not, what else might we be presenting with more certainty than the record allows? The question extends to some of the larger structural claims about Pompeii's early history. The narrative of Etruscan influence, for instance, is built on real archaeological evidence, the style of the early tufa walls, certain construction techniques, the layout of some domestic structures, but the nature of the relationship between Pompeii and the Etruscans' power centred at Capua is far less clear than it is often made to appear. The characterization of this relationship as a peaceful political and economic alignment rather than a violent conquest is widely repeated, but it rests more on the absence of evidence for destruction than on the presence of evidence for cooperation. In archaeology, absence of evidence is a notoriously unreliable guide. Buildings can be destroyed and rebuilt without leaving traces that survive of 2.5 millennia of subsequent occupation. A conquest can be thorough and unearth, to leave no burn layer, no mass grave, no shattered fortification, and still be a conquest. Some researchers have argued that the Etruscan period at Pompeii may have involved more coercion than the standard account suggests, pointing to the rapid and comprehensive changes in building technique and civic organisation that accompanied their arrival. Others maintain that the evidence, thin as it is, best supports a model of voluntary integration. The disagreement has not been resolved and may never be, because the physical record from this period is simply too sparse to bear the weight of a definitive conclusion. A similar caution applies to the number of Sullan veterans settled in the city after 80 BC. The figure of approximately 2,000 is cited with frequency and apparent confidence across academic and popular sources alike, but it derives from estimates based on the known size of veteran colonies elsewhere in Italy during the same period, combined with inferences about Pompeii's carrying capacity and the scale of property confiscation. No ancient source provides a precise number, no inscription records the tally. The figure may be roughly correct, or it may be significantly off in either direction. And the difference matters because the social dynamics of the post-Sullan city, the degree of tension between the old population and the new colonists, the speed of cultural integration, the distribution of political power, all depend in part on how many newcomers actually arrived. A colony of 2,000 veterans imposed on a city of perhaps 10 to 15,000 inhabitants is one kind of story. A colony of 500 or of 4,000 is quite another, and we are not in a position to say with confidence which version is closest to the truth. None of this means the broader narrative is wrong. The archaeological evidence for successive waves of external influence at Pompeii Greek, Etruscan, Samnite Roman is substantial and well documented. The physical transformation of the city under each new ruling group is visible in the ground. The walls really were rebuilt in different materials by different hands. The forum really was reshaped multiple times. The cultural layering is not a scholarly invention. It is literally embedded in the stratigraphy. What deserves caution is not the pattern itself, but the precision and confidence with which the individual details within that pattern are sometimes reported. The temptation when telling the story of a place as dramatic as Pompeii is to smooth the rough edges, to fill the gaps with reasonable assumptions, and present them as established facts to give the audience the satisfying feeling of a story fully known. But a story fully known is not what the evidence offers. What it offers instead is a story richly suggested, powerfully indicated, and honest enough if we let it be to admit where the light runs out and the guessing begins. The walls still stand, the layers still speak, and the pattern of a city built, rebuilt, conquered and rebuilt again is not diminished by acknowledging that some of its chapters are written in ink too faint to read with certainty. If anything, the honesty makes what we can see more vivid, more worth examining, more deserving of the care that the next phase of Pompeii and life, its golden age under the Roman peace, would both reward and ultimately betray. The Empire of Soil. Around the year 20 BC, workers in the hills above the Bay of Naples began laying the stones for an engineering project of extraordinary ambition. It was an aqueduct, but not of the ordinary kind, not a single channel serving a single city as had been the Roman practice for generations. This was a regional network, a branching system of tunnels, channels and distribution points that would stretch for nearly 100 miles across the Campanian landscape, making it the longest aqueduct in the Roman world at the time of its construction. It was named the Aqua Augusta in honour of the emperor, who had made it possible, and Pompeii was one of the cities it served. The connection changed daily life in ways that are difficult to overstate. For the first time, a constant and reliable supply of clean mountain water flowed directly into the city's heart, gushing from public fountains placed at regular intervals along the streets, available to every citizen regardless of wealth or status. For the very rich, the aqueduct offered something even more remarkable, a private connection that brought running water directly into their homes, feeding garden fountains, filling bathing pools, and sustaining a level of domestic comfort that would not be matched again in this part of Europe for more than 1,000 years. The aqueduct was a product of the Pax Romana, the long imperial peace that had settled over the Mediterranean world after decades of civil war. In 31 BC, Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, had defeated his last rival at the Battle of Actium, and within a few years he had taken the name Augustus and reshaped the Roman Republic into something new, a vast empire governed by a single will. For a city like Pompeii, the arrival of this peace felt less like a political event than a change in the weather. The fear of marching armies, of shifting loyalties, of sudden violence arriving from beyond the horizon, all of it faded. The sea lanes that connected Pompeii to the wider Mediterranean grew safe and predictable. Trade that had been disrupted by decades of conflict resumed with a new intensity, and the wealth that had always been latent in Campania's volcanic soil began to flow outward on a scale the region had never seen before. Pompeii was no longer merely a prosperous local town. It was becoming a node in an imperial economy, a place where the raw abundance of the land was transformed into products that carried the name of Vesuvius across the known world. The transformation was visible in the landscape itself. The old patchwork of small family farms that had sustained the city for centuries was steadily absorbed into larger estates consolidated under owners who approached agriculture not as a way of life but as an enterprise. Hillsides were terraced with high-yield vines and olive trees, planted in dense, organised rows designed to maximise output rather than beauty. At harvest, the production was industrial in scale. Grapes were pressed in large facilities, the juice fermented and aged, then sealed in the familiar two-handled amphorae that were the standard shipping containers of the Roman world. Each vessel was stamped with the estate's mark, a guarantee of origin and quality that functioned in effect as an ancient brand. The wines of Vesuvius were not considered the finest in the empire. That distinction belonged to the vineyards of Falernum, further up the coast, but they were reliable, plentiful and affordable, and they found eager buyers from Gaul to Egypt. The olive oil followed a similar trajectory, processed on the estates, sealed in amphorae, and shipped in bulk to markets that seemed to have no limit to their appetite for Campanian produce. But Pompeii was more than farmland and harbour. Within its walls, an entire ecosystem of artisans and manufacturers had developed, feeding off the agricultural wealth of the surrounding countryside and adding layers of value before goods were shipped outward. The city's textile makers were renowned across the region, transforming locally sourced wool into fine cloth that was traded far beyond Campania's borders. The process was elaborate, and by a modern sensibility startlingly unpleasant. Raw wool passed through fulleries where labourers stamped and scoured the fabric in vats of liquid, whose principal active ingredient was human urine, collected in public amphorae, placed on street corners and valued for the ammonia it contained. The result, once the cloth had been bleached or dyed, was a product of genuine quality, soft and durable enough to command premium prices in distant markets. Perfume workshops thrived alongside the textile trade, blending imported spices with native flowers and herbs to produce scented oils that were bottled by the city's glassblowers. A neat chain of interdependent industries, each one sustaining the others in a cycle of production that was nearly self-contained. And then there was garum. If any single product defined Pompeii's commercial identity during the imperial period, it was this pungent fermented fish sauce that the Romans used as a universal condiment, drizzled on bread, mixed into stews, splashed over vegetables, added to almost every dish in quantities that suggest an addiction and more than a preference. The production of garum was concentrated in large workshops near the port where the leftover parts of the fishing catch the heads. The guts, the small bony fish that had no other market value, were layered with coarse salt in stone vats and left to decompose under the Campanian sun for weeks or even months. The smell, by all ancient accounts, was extraordinary, but the product was liquid gold. The finest grades, carefully filtered and aged, were sealed in small elegant vessels and marketed as a luxury item, while the cheaper residue was shipped in bulk to supply the Roman army's insatiable demand. Some producers became spectacularly wealthy, their names stamped on jars that have been recovered from archaeological sites as far away as Britain and the Black Sea, evidence of a commercial reach that seems almost improbable for a city of Pompeii's modest size. The wealth generated by this trade did not remain invisible. It poured back into the city in the form of new construction, lavish decoration, and a standard of public amenity that rivaled towns many times Pompeii's size. Workers paved the old dirt streets with heavy blocks of volcanic basalt, raised high sidewalks to protect pedestrians from the traffic of carts and mules, and placed large stepping stones at intersections so that people could cross above the flow of rainwater and refuse that ran in the gutters below. Augustus himself became a presence in the city's spiritual life. A temple dedicated to the divine spirit of the living emperor rose in the forum, and families across the city added the guardian spirits of the imperial household to the small shrines that occupied a corner of nearly every Pompeian home. The emperor was no longer merely a distant ruler. He was a god in the making, woven into the daily rituals of ordinary life, and the city that honoured him thrived under his protection, with a confidence that felt to those living through it as though it might last forever. But forever in the shadow of Vesuvius has always been a shorter word than it sounds. Bread, blood and voices on the wall. How many people lived in Pompeii at its peak? The question sounds straightforward, but the answers offered by those scholars vary enough to remind us how much uncertainty still surrounds even the most basic facts about this city. Estimates range from around 11,000 to as high as 20,000, depending on assumptions about household size, the density of occupation in the residential blocks, and whether the surrounding farmland population is included. What is not in dispute is that Pompeii, whatever its precise population, was a crowded and intensely social place. A city where private space was limited, public space was constant, and the boundary between the two was thinner than almost anything we would recognize today. Most of the city's residents lived in homes without kitchens, or with cooking facilities so rudimentary that preparing a full meal at home was impractical. For these people, daily sustenance came not from their own hearths, but from the thermohulia, hot food counters built into the facades of buildings along nearly every major street. Their marble countertops fitted with recessed vessels that held stews, soups, grains, and whatever the morning's market had offered. Archaeologists have counted over 80 of these establishments within the excavated portions of the city, a density that suggests a population fed largely in public eating shoulder to shoulder with neighbours, strangers, and the enslaved workers who moved through the same streets on their masters' errands. The enslaved population of Pompeii is the foundation the city preferred not to discuss, though it depended on that foundation for everything. Every industry that made the city prosperous, the farms, the fulleries, the garum workshops, the bakeries, the construction crews, the household staffs of the wealthy, ran on the forced labour of men, women and children who had no legal claim to their own bodies, their own time, or the products of their own hands. The bakeries are perhaps the most vivid illustration. In several excavated examples, the grinding mills, heavy volcanic stone cylinders turned by wooden beams, were found with iron shackles nearby, evidence that the labourers who turned them day after day were chained to their work in the most literal sense. The city's golden age, like Rome's own, was built on a brutality so pervasive that it was not experienced as cruelty by those who benefited from it. It was simply the order of things, as invisible to the comfortable as the air they breathed, and as essential to the economy as the volcanic soil beneath their feet. And yet within this system, Roman law permitted a possibility that distinguished it from many other slave-holding societies of the ancient world: the act of manumission, the formal freeing of a slave by their master. The path was narrow, uncertain, and available to only a small fraction of the enslaved population. A slave might be freed in a master's will as a final gesture of gratitude for years of loyal service. Others, particularly those with valuable skills in commerce or craft, were sometimes allowed to earn their own money, and could over many years of careful accumulation purchase their own liberty. Freedom, when it came, was not complete. A freedman remained legally bound by obligations to his former master, and the social stigma of servitude followed him for life. He could not hold public office, could not fully escape the taint of his origins, and occupied a permanent middle ground between the enslaved and the freeborn. But the possibility of manumission, however limited, acted as a powerful engine within Pompeii's economy. Freedmen who had risen from nothing brought to the marketplace a drive and a commercial sharpness that the comfortable old elite often lacked. They became managers of workshops, operators of trading vessels, brokers of deals that moved goods across the Mediterranean, and some of them accumulated fortunes that rivaled or exceeded those of the freeborn families who still looked down on them. The tension between wealth and status, between economic power and social respectability, became one of the defining dynamics of Pompeian life, a friction that the earthquake of 62 AD would eventually crack wide open, but that was already visible in the decades before. The city's confidence during this period expressed itself most forcefully in spectacle. The amphitheatre that Sulla's colonists had built on the city's eastern edge had become the emotional centre of Pompeian life, the place where the entire population gathered, from the wealthiest patron in his reserved front row seat to the humblest labourer standing in the upper tiers to watch the brutal theatre of gladiatorial combat. The games were not merely entertainment. They were civic rituals, occasions of collective identity moments, when the city performed its unity and its power for itself. Wealthy citizens sponsored the games as acts of public generosity, and their names were painted in bold red letters on the walls of buildings across the city, advertising upcoming bouts and celebrating the sponsor's munificence. It was into this charged atmosphere that in the year 59 AD a disaster arrived, not from the mountain or the earth, but from the crowd itself. A particularly grand set of games had drawn spectators from across the region, including large numbers from the neighbouring city of Nuceria, with whom Pompey maintained a rivalry that blended economic competition with civic pride and a measure of genuine hostility. The trouble began in the stands, not on the sand. Taunts escalated into thrown objects. Thrown objects became fists. Fists became weapons. The brawl spilled out of the amphitheatre and into the surrounding streets, and by the time it subsided, the Nucerians, outnumbered and caught in hostile territory, had suffered grievous casualties. The dead and wounded were carried back to Nuceria, where the outrage was immediate and absolute. A delegation travelled to Rome to appeal directly to Emperor Nero, and the Senate launched a formal investigation. The verdict was humiliating. Pompey was banned from holding gladiatorial games for 10 years. The sponsor of the fatal games and those judged to have incited the violence were sent into exile. The amphitheatre fell silent, its vast stone bowl empty, and the city lost the ritual that had bound its people together more powerfully than any temple or forum. Life continued, of course. The markets opened each morning, the baths still steamed, offerings were made at the temples, and graffiti continued to accumulate on every available wall. Political slogans promoting candidates for office, advertisements for upcoming events, declarations of love and lust, crude insults aimed at rivals, and even consumer complaints about watered-down wine in local taverns. This graffiti, scratched and painted by hands across every level of society, is among the most remarkable evidence Pompeii has yielded. It reveals us a city where literacy was widespread, where ordinary people felt entitled to a public voice, and where the walls themselves served as a kind of open forum, chaotic, uncensored, and profoundly alive. The amphitheatre may have been silenced, but the city's conversation with itself never paused. And beneath that conversation, beneath the streets and the fountains and the deep volcanic soil, the earth had already begun to shift in ways that no voice on any wall would be able to warn them about. The earth breaks. On the 5th of February 62 AD, the ground beneath Pompeii began to move. The people were not strangers to tremors. Minor earthquakes were a familiar part of life in the shadow of Vesuvius, small shudders that rattled cups on shelves and sent a ripple of unease through the household before passing as quickly as they came. This one began the same way. A low vibration, a faint sense of displacement, the kind of thing a person might pause for and then dismiss. But it did not pass. The shaking built, steadily growing stronger with each second until the ground was heaving with a force that no one in the city had ever experienced. People rushed from their homes into the streets, but the streets offered no safety. Roof tiles slid and shattered on the paving stones. Plaster cracked and fell from facades. Walls that had stood for generations began to lean and then to buckle, sending clouds of dust into the air as they came apart. The earthquake of 62 AD was not the tremor they had learned to live with. It was something else entirely, a sustained, violent rupture that seemed to those caught in it as though the earth itself had decided to reject everything that had been built upon it. The damage to the city was catastrophic. In the Forum, the civic and spiritual heart of Pompeii, entire sections collapsed. The great columns of the basilica cracked and toppled. The Capitolium, the temple to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, that had been the centerpiece of Roman religious life in the city since Sulla's refoundation, was reduced to a shattered ruin. Other temples fared no better. Across the residential quarters, private homes and workshops suffered again on a scale that left whole blocks uninhabitable. Some reduced to rubble, outright, others still standing, but so dangerously unstable that no one dared enter them. The Aqua Augusta. The great aqueduct that had transformed daily life by bringing clean mountain water into the city was damaged along its route. The public fountains that had gushed on every corner fell silent. In a single day, Pompeii lost not only its grandest buildings, but the infrastructure that sustained its most basic functions: water, shelter, commerce, worship. The aftershocks continued for days, each new tremor, sending weakened structures crashing down and driving survivors back into the open spaces, where they stayed. They huddled together, afraid to return to homes that might bury them in their sleep. The people of Pompeii did not interpret this disaster the way a modern observer might. They had no framework for understanding earthquakes as geological events, as the release of tectonic stress along fault lines deep beneath the surface. To them, the destruction was a message, a divine judgment, a sign that the relationship between their city and the gods had been broken in some fundamental way. The temples that lay in ruins were not merely buildings. They were the physical homes of the deities who protected the city, and their collapse carried a spiritual weight that was for many Pompeians more terrifying than the physical destruction itself. Something had gone wrong between the human world and the divine, and until that breach was healed, no amount of rebuilding could guarantee safety. The task of reconstruction was enormous, and the response to it revealed fault lines in Pompeian society that the earthquake had not created, but had suddenly made visible. The traditional landowning elite, the old families whose names had governed the city and funded its public monuments for generations, faced a choice. Their wealth was not concentrated solely in Pompeii. Many owned villas and estates elsewhere in Italy, and a ruined city in the shadow of an angry heaven was not an investment that inspired confidence. Quietly, steadily, they began to leave, not all at once and not without exception, but in sufficient numbers that their departure opened a vacuum in the city's social and political life that would be filled by people the old aristocracy had always regarded with a mixture of dependence and contempt. The freedmen, former slaves who had earned or purchased their liberty and built commercial fortunes in the bustling economy of imperial Pompeii, had no estates in the hills of Tuscany or villas on the Amalfi coast to retreat to. Their entire world was invested in this one city, in its workshops and warehouses, its trade networks and rental properties. For them, the earthquake was not a reason to leave. It was an opportunity to rise. They began purchasing the damaged and abandoned properties of the departing aristocracy, at fractions of their former value, acquiring, in a few years, what generations of social convention had denied them: the physical markers of status, the grand houses, with their painted walls and columned courtyards, the visible evidence of belonging to the city's upper tier. Some of these homes were converted into commercial spaces, their elegant gardens torn out to make room for bakeries, fooleries, or rental apartments. Others were lavishly restored, redecorated in the latest and most fashionable style of fresco painting as the new owners sought to announce their arrival at the top of a social order that was being rewritten in real time. Roman law placed a hard ceiling on this ambition no freedman, regardless of wealth, could hold public office. That path remained closed, sealed by the legal memory of servitude. But their children, if born after manumission, were full Roman citizens with no such restriction. And so the freedmen of Pompeii developed a strategy of generational investment funding, the reconstruction of civic monuments and public buildings, not in their own names, but in the names of their freeborn sons, building political careers for the next generation with the wealth accumulated by a generation that would never be permitted to hold power itself. It was a patient, calculated negotiation with a system designed to exclude them, and it had reshaped Pompeii's social fabric as profoundly as the earthquake had reshaped its physical one. 17 years later, when the mountain finally spoke, the city it buried was not the Pompeii of the old Samnite elite, and not quite the Pompeii of the Roman colonists. It was a city in the middle of becoming something new, a transformation that the eruption would freeze, preserve, and leave for the future to uncover. The mountain wakes. Across the bay from Pompeii at the naval base of Moisenum lived a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to understand the natural world. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Elder, and he was by the standards of his age the closest thing the Roman Empire had to a scientist. He served as commander of the imperial fleet, a position of considerable military responsibility, but his true obsession lay elsewhere. His great work, the Naturalis Historia, was a monumental encyclopedia that attempted to catalogue everything the Roman world knew about the earth, its creatures, its plants, its minerals, its weather, and its phenomena. It ran to 37 volumes and drew on hundreds of earlier sources, and it remains one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the ancient world. If any person alive in 79 AD was equipped to recognise the warning signs of what was about to happen, it was Pliny, and yet he saw nothing. To him, as to every Roman who looked northward across the bay, the great mountain that dominated the skyline was simply Vesuvius, a peaceful vine-covered peak, a feature of the landscape so familiar and so benign that no one thought to question its silence. The mountain had not erupted in living memory, nor in the memory of anyone's grandparents, nor in any written record that survived. Its last major eruption had occurred roughly 1700 years before an event so distant that it had passed entirely out of human knowledge and into the deep time of geology. The Romans did not even have a word for what Vesuvius was. The concept of a volcano, a mountain capable of periodic catastrophic eruption, did not exist in their scientific vocabulary. They were in the most literal sense blind to the danger they lived beside. The mountain, however, had been sending signals for years. The earthquake of 62 AD, which had devastated Pompeii and damaged cities across the region, was almost certainly related to the volcanic activity building beneath the surface. In the years that followed, minor tremors occurred with increasing frequency, so common in fact that the people of Pompeii had learned to ignore them, treating each small shudder as a familiar nuisance rather than a warning. Reports from the countryside told of springs and wells that had flowed for generations suddenly running dry, a phenomenon that modern volcanologists recognize as a classic precursor to eruption caused by the movement of magma through underground rock formations that disrupts the natural flow of groundwater. But no one in the first century possessed the framework to connect these scattered observations into a coherent picture of danger. The tremors were the earth being restless. The dry wells were bad luck, or perhaps another sign of divine displeasure. The mountain was the mountain. It had always been there. It would always be there. In the late summer or early autumn of 79 AD, the exact date remains a matter of scholarly debate, that we will return to the pressure that had been building beneath Vesuvius for centuries finally exceeded the strength of the rock above it. Pliny and his nephew, the younger Pliny, were at Misenum when they noticed something extraordinary in the sky to the east. A cloud was rising from the summit of Vesuvius, but it was unlike any cloud either of them had ever seen. It climbed on a tall, dark trunk of ash and gas, rising with terrifying speed, and then spread outward at its top into a broad, flat canopy, a shape the younger Pliny would later compare in a letter that became one of the most important documents in the history of natural science to a Mediterranean umbrella pine. The elder Pliny's reaction was immediate and characteristic. his scientific curiosity was ignited. He ordered a fast boat prepared so that he could sail across the bay for a closer look at the phenomenon. But before he could depart, a desperate message arrived from a friend, a woman named Rectina, trapped in her seaside villa on the coast directly below the erupting mountain begging for rescue. In that moment, the naturalist became an admiral. Pliny ordered the full fleet launched not for scientific observation, but for the evacuation of the densely populated coastline that lay directly in the path of the advancing cloud. As the warships crossed the bay, conditions deteriorated with horrifying speed. Fine grey ash began to settle on the decks, followed by a hail of lightweight pumice fragments of volcanic rock ejected from the eruption column and carried by the wind across the water. The sea itself was choked with floating debris, and as the fleet approached the shore, they found the coastline physically transformed beaches that had existed that morning were now buried under mounds of hot fire-scorched stone. A landing near the mountain was impossible. Pliny redirected the fleet southward along the coast to the town of Stabiae, where he went ashore at the villa of a friend named Pomponianus. He found the man paralysed with terror. Pliny, in a gesture that his nephew would later describe with admiration bordering on reverence, embraced his friend, called for a bath, and then sat down to dine as though nothing were amiss. Whether this display of calm was genuine courage or a performance designed to steady the nerves of those around him is a question that only Pliny himself could have answered. And the younger Pliny's account, written decades later at the request of the historian Tacitus, is candid enough to acknowledge the ambiguity, noting that his uncle showed cheerfulness, or at the very least a convincing imitation of it. Meanwhile, the prevailing wind carried the eruption column directly over Pompeii, and the city entered its final hours. A dense rain of pumice and ash descended on the streets, falling with such intensity that it began to accumulate in layers, first ankle-deep, then knee-deep, then rising steadily toward the rooftops. The sky went dark. The air thickened with dust and heat and the acrid smell of sulphur. People were forced into an impossible choice shelter inside their homes and hope the roofs held, or venture out into a storm of hot gravel, falling from an invisible sky. Those who stayed indoors found the exits slowly sealed, as debris piled against their doors. Those who fled stumbled through streets they could no longer see, guided only by the sound of voices and the feel of walls beneath their hands. The pumice itself was light individual stones, could be brushed away with a hand, but the sheer volume was overwhelming, and as the hours passed, the weight on the rooftops became unbearable. Timbers groaned, ceilings sagged, and then in home after home across the city, the structures gave way and the roofs came down on the families huddled beneath them. The mountain had waited 17 centuries to speak, and now that it had begun, it was not yet finished. The worst was still hours away, gathering its strength in the column of fire and ash that still climbed impossibly high into the darkened sky above, the surge and the silence. Late in the night, the eruption entered a phase that no one on the ground could have anticipated, because nothing in Roman experience provided a frame of reference for what was about to happen. The towering column of ash and gas that had been climbing into the atmosphere for hours, reaching heights that modern volcanologists estimate at over 30 kilometers, became unstable. The material it had been ejecting was no longer rising fast enough to sustain its own weight. Somewhere high above the mountain, the column faltered, and then it collapsed. What came down was not a continuation of the pumice fall that had been burying Pompeii grain by grain for the past 12 hours. It was something fundamentally different, a pyroclastic surge, an avalanche of superheated gas ash and pulverized rock that rolled down the mountainside at speeds that may have exceeded 100 kilometers per hour. Hugging the ground, filling every depression, flowing around every obstacle and carrying temperatures high enough to kill any living thing in its path instantaneously. The first surge did not reach Pompeii. It swept down the western slope of Vesuvius and struck the smaller coastal town of Herculaneum, which had endured the eruption's opening hours with far less damage than its neighbour, because the prevailing wind had carried the pumice fall in the opposite direction. That reprieve ended in seconds. The surge engulfed the town, completely killing hundreds of its inhabitants who had gathered at the waterfront in the desperate hope that rescue might arrive by sea. Their bodies, discovered in the 1980s in the boat chambers along the ancient shoreline, remain among the most haunting archaeological finds in the region. Entire families huddled together, some still clutching the possessions they had grabbed in their flight, preserved not by the slow accumulation of pumice, but by the instantaneous violence of superheated gas. A second surge followed, larger and more powerful than the first, and it buried Herculaneum under a layer of volcanic material, so deep in some places exceeding 20 meters, that the town would not be discovered again for more than 16 centuries. On the shore at Stabiae, several kilometers south of the eruption, Pliny the Elder and his companions passed a night of growing terror. The ground shook without ceasing. The buildings around them swayed and cracked. Pumice continued to fall, accumulating in the courtyard of the villa until the doors could barely be forced open. When morning came, it brought no light, only a heavy, sulphurous gloom that made torches necessary at midday. Pliny and his party tied pillows to their heads as crude protection against the falling stones and made their way down to the shore, hoping that the sea had calmed enough to permit an escape by boat. It had not. The water was violent and disordered, pulled and pushed by forces beneath the surface that the Romans had no name for and no way to understand. Around this time, the third pyroclastic surge broke from the collapsing eruption column and raced toward Pompeii. It struck the city's northern walls, the same walls that had withstood Sulla's siege engines 2 centuries before, with a force that masonry was never designed to resist. The surge crested the fortifications and poured into the northern districts of the city, but its energy was partially spent by the time it reached the interior, and its penetration was limited. The fourth surge, following close behind, was not so constrained. It swept over the entire city in a single scorching wave, penetrating every street, every doorway, every window, every crack in every wall. All who remained alive within Pompeii, those who had sheltered in sealed rooms, those who had been trapped by debris, those who had been trying to navigate the pitch-dark streets in a final attempt to flee, died within seconds. The heat alone was sufficient to cause instantaneous death. The ash that followed sealed their bodies in place, preserving not just their skeletons, but in many cases the precise postures of their final moments, a detail that would not be understood or recovered for nearly 1800 years. On the beach at Stabiae, the air grew thick with fumes. Pliny the Elder, who had suffered from weak lungs throughout his life, began to falter. He called for cold water and lay down on a cloth spread on the ground, but the relief he sought did not come. When the next advancing surge drove his companions to flee inland, Pliny could not follow. He was found later where he had fallen. His body intact with no visible wounds, a death caused not by fire or impact, but by the suffocating atmosphere that the eruption had created, crossed the entire bay. His nephew at Misenum on the far side of the water experienced the final hours of the eruption as a descent into what seemed like the end of the world. The sea pulled away from the shore in a sudden unnatural recession, leaving fish and sea creatures stranded on exposed sand. A massive black cloud rolled across the bay, swallowing the coastline, the water and the sky. When it reached Misenum, the darkness was so complete that the younger Pliny could not see his own hand. Around him, people screamed for family members, wept, prayed, and many concluded, not unreasonably given what they were witnessing, that the world itself was ending, that the gods had withdrawn, and that this was the final and permanent night. It was not. The darkness lifted slowly and unevenly, and the people of Misenum emerged to find their town coated in a thick layer of grey ash, but otherwise intact. They swept their doorsteps, checked on their neighbours, and began the long process of returning to normal life. Across the bay, no such return was possible. Pompeii lay beneath meters of pumice and ash. Its streets buried its buildings, entombed its final population, sealed in the positions where death had found them. The city that survived Etruscan ambition, Samnite warfare, Roman conquest, civil rebellion, imperial politics, a catastrophic earthquake, and a humiliating civic scandal had finally encountered the one force it could not negotiate with, outlast, or rebuild from. The mountain had spoken, and its word was absolute. But the silence that followed was not as complete as it seemed. Even in the immediate aftermath, even as the ash still settled, and the air still tasted of sulphur, the story of Pompeii was not over. The majority of its population had fled during the early hours of the eruption, and they carried with them not only their lives, but the memory of what had been lost, a memory that would drive them back to the buried city sooner than anyone might have expected, and for reasons that had less to do with grief than with the wealth still trapped beneath the ground. The city that would not disappear. What does a city become when no one alive remembers where it is? For more than 1,000 years, the answer in Pompeii's case was a name without a place, a ghost preserved, not in stone, but in parchment copied by monks in distant monasteries who faithfully transcribed the letters of a young Roman official without ever knowing that the city he described still existed perfectly intact beneath the farmland of southern Italy. The younger Pliny's 2 letters to the historian Tacitus, written roughly 25 years after the eruption at the request of a friend compiling the definitive history of the period, became the only surviving eyewitness account of the catastrophe. They preserved the death of Pliny the Elder with vivid and affecting detail. They described the eruption column, the falling pumice, the darkness, the terror of the crowd at Misenum, but they did not preserve the location of Pompeii with enough precision for later generations to find it. The letters survived. The city vanished. And for century after century, the 2 existed in separate worlds, one in the pages of classical literature, the other in the silent darkness beneath a vine-covered mound that local farmers knew only as La Civita, the city and name whispered without real understanding of what lay below. The first physical contact with the buried ruins came blindly in the late 16th century, when the architect Domenico Fontana cut a new channel for the Sarno River directly through the site. His workers struck ancient walls still bearing painted frescoes and uncovered an inscription that included the word Pompeius, a direct reference to a Pompeian official. The clue was there carved in stone, but the world was not ready to read it. Scholars assume Pompes referred to the Roman general Pompey the Great, and the site was dismissed as the remains of a private villa. Fontana completed his canal and reburied the ruins without further investigation, and Pompeii returned to its sleep for another 150 years. It was not until excavations at nearby Herculaneum in the 1730s, driven by the treasure-hunting ambitions of Charles of Bourbon, King of Naples, that attention returned to the Campanian landscape with sufficient intensity to lead eventually back to Pompeii. The early work was crude. Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre, the Spanish military engineer who directed the excavations, approached the buried cities as a mining operation, driving tunnels into the hardened volcanic rock with the sole aim of extracting beautiful objects for the royal collection. Frescoes were cut from walls, statues were hauled out of the darkness, mosaics were prized from floors. The context in which these objects had existed, their position within a room, their relationship to each other, the story they told as parts of a larger whole was ignored entirely. The quiet turning point came in 1750 when a Swiss engineer named Carl Jakob Weber took charge of the day-to-day excavations at La Civita. Weber found a site fundamentally different from the deep rock-encased tunnels of Herculaneum. Here the burial layer was lighter pumice and ash rather than solidified volcanic mud, and it could be removed from above, exposing the ruins to open air, rather than requiring miners to bore through them in the dark. Weber seized this opportunity with a discipline that his predecessors had lacked entirely. He created detailed architectural plans of every structure he uncovered. He recorded the precise location of every object, understanding that a bronze lamp found in a bedroom told a different story than the same lamp found in a shop. He documented not only the grand public buildings, but the humble homes and commercial premises that lined the streets between them. It was the beginning of something that did not yet have a name, a methodology that would eventually become the discipline of archaeology. And in 1763, Weber's patient approach yielded its most consequential result. Workers clearing the area around a city gate uncovered a formal public inscription bearing the words Res Publica Pompeianorum, the state of the Pompeians. After 15 years of excavation, the site had finally been identified. The ghost in the ancient text and the body in the ground were reunited at last, and the discovery sent a tremor of excitement across the intellectual world of Europe that would reshape Western art and culture for a generation. But it was Giuseppe Fiorelli, appointed Director of Excavations in 1860 under the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, who transformed Pompeii from a royal treasure quarry into a place of genuine historical understanding. Fiorelli reversed the destructive top-to-bottom clearance methods of his predecessors, insisting instead on careful layer-by-layer excavation that preserved the integrity of upper floors and prevented the structural collapses that had plagued earlier digs. He divided the city into a systematic grid of 9 regions each, with numbered blocks and individually addressed doorways, a cataloguing system so effective that it remains in use today. And it was Fiorelli who devised the technique that would do more than any other single innovation to fix Pompeii in the modern imagination. When his workers encountered hollow cavities in the hardened ash voids left by the decomposition of organic matter over 18 centuries, Sir Piet Fiorelli understood what they represented. He ordered liquid plaster poured into the spaces, and when the surrounding ash was carefully removed, what emerged were the casts of human beings frozen in the postures of their final moments. A mother curled over her child, a man covering his face with his hands, a dog straining against its chain. The plaster casts collapsed the distance between the ancient world and the modern one, with a force that no statue or fresco could match because they were not art. They were evidence, the direct physical imprint of suffering, preserved by the same catastrophe that had caused it. Today, Pompeii exists in a state of unresolved tension. It is the most visited archaeological site in Italy, and among the most visited in the world, drawing millions of people each year into streets that were last walked by their original inhabitants nearly 2,000 years ago. And yet the very act of excavation that revealed the city to the modern world also began its second destruction. Sun fades the frescoes. Rain weakens the mortar. Roots pry apart walls that survived the eruption intact. Allied bombs scarred the site in 1943. Decades of governmental neglect led to what scholars have called Pompeii's second death, a slow-grinding deterioration that culminated in 2010 when the House of the Gladiators collapsed into rubble after days of heavy rain sparking international outrage and the launch of the Great Pompeii Project. Around a third of the city remains unexcavated, deliberately left beneath the ground that has protected it for millennia, a recognition that the safest place for Pompeii's remaining secrets may be exactly where they are. And above it all, Vesuvius still stands, monitored, measured, but undiminished. More than 3 million people live in its shadow today, and scientists consider it overdue for another major eruption. The story that began with 5 Oscan villages on a ridge of cooled lava has not ended. It has only paused as it has paused before, waiting for the next chapter that the mountain, the earth, or the slow patience of human curiosity will eventually write. The hollow space is still there. Somewhere beneath the hardened ash of Pompeii there are voids that have not yet been found, cavities shaped by bodies that decomposed centuries ago, sealed in darkness, holding nothing but the precise memory of a form. No plaster has filled them, no careful hands have brushed away the surrounding rock to reveal what lies within. They wait in the same silence they have kept since the mountain stopped speaking. And they may wait for decades more or centuries because the people who now tend this site have come to understand something that earlier generations did not. That some things are better left where they are protected by the very burial that preserved them until a future arrives that is wise enough and careful enough to bring them into the light without losing what the darkness kept safe. We have followed this city through a long arc tonight from 5 villages on a ridge of cooled lava to a thriving Roman port from the first Oscan farmers who planted olive trees in volcanic soil, to the freedmen who bought shattered villas from the rubble of an earthquake and turned ruin into opportunity. We trace the layers in the walls. Tufa cut under Etruscan influence, Sarno limestone raised by Samnite hands, Roman concrete poured over both, and in those layers we found not a single story, but many, each one written over the last, each one incomplete. The Greeks brought pottery and ideas. The Samnites brought defences and pride. Rome brought law, spectacle, and a new language that slowly pushed the old one into the quiet corners of the home. The mountain brought fertility, and then it brought fire. And then it brought a silence so deep that 1,000 years passed before anyone remembered what was buried beneath the vineyards. Not all of this is certain. The name itself may not mean what we think it means. The number of veterans Sulla settled within the walls may have been larger or smaller than the figure that appears in every guidebook. The date of the eruption, August, or October, summer, or autumn, remains a question that new evidence continues to reopen rather than close. And the lives of the people who walked these streets, the specific textures of their days, the particular weight of their fears and ambitions and small pleasures, are things that no excavation, however meticulous, can fully recover. What the stones offer is not a complete portrait. It is a suggestion, rich, vivid, layered with detail, but honest enough, if we let it be, to admit where the edges blur and the guessing begins. And perhaps that is not a failure of the record, but a quality of it, a reminder that every city, like every life, contains rooms that remain closed even to those who lived in them. There is one question that the site will never stop asking, though it asks it so quietly that you might not hear it unless you are very still. More than 3 million people live in the shadow of Vesuvius today. The mountain is monitored, measured, studied with instruments that Pliny the Elder could not have imagined, and yet it remains what it has always been, an active volcano in a state of temporary rest. Its silence no more permanent now than it was 2,000 years ago. The people who live there know this. They have always known, and they stay not because they have forgotten the past, but because the soil is dark and generous, and the bay is beautiful, and home is a thing that roots itself deeper than reason or fear. Let that thought settle now, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as the last image before the quiet comes. A mountain green with forest, a plain dark with volcanic earth, a city beneath the surface still holding its shape after all this time, patient and silent and full of rooms no one has entered yet. You have walked far tonight, traveller. The streets are behind you now. The ash has settled. The air is cool and still, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let the weight of the ancient stones be something that holds you steady rather than something that presses down. Let the long story fade to a murmur, and then to a hum, and then to the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the silence of a place that has said everything it can, and is content for now to simply be. Sleep well. The city will be there in the morning as it has been for 2,000 years, waiting for no one in particular, asking nothing, keeping everything it was given quiet beneath the vines.